Hi, everybody in Psych 101. By now, you should have taken the first exam, and we are now ready for Chapter 5, which will be one of 3 chapters on the second exam. Today's chapter is learning. Now, in all honesty, sometimes I think this should be the first chapter because we all need to know how to learn and how to learn effectively. But it's the 5th chapter in the book and the 4th one that we cover since we don't do chapter 3 in this course. So let's get started. Chapter 5, Learning. First of all, the definition of learning is important. It's a relatively permanent change in behavior due to practice or experience. Again, follow along in the PowerPoint. Why is it relatively permanent? Because people forget. You could learn something, and then later on, you don't remember it, or you don't even know it anymore. The only way to learn things is through practice, you've done it before, or experience. You were there when it happened. Now, if this was an in-person class, both of those things would be important. By studying, you practice, and by being in class, you experience it. Well, these videos hopefully work with regard to you experiencing it, and hopefully you study, and that's practice. So moving right along. Learning all started with a guy named Ivan Pavlov. Perhaps you've heard of him and his dogs. Classical conditioning. Involuntary behavior is what we are going to be talking about first. John Watson carried on this type of research in the United States, yet it was about 10-15 years later when he did his most noteworthy research. Classical conditioning. So if you follow along with the PowerPoints, as you should be reading them, we're going to start by talking about Pavlov. Pavlov was studying digestion in dogs, not learning. He stumbled upon learning by accident. What Pavlov did was had dogs in his laboratory. They were tied up to these little wooden contraptions with a leash and rope in some cases, and he would ring a bell and his assistant would come feed them. Pavlov wanted to know how saliva is produced in the mouth and how that helps you chew, swallow, and digest food. Sounds kind of gross, doesn't it? Well, that's what he was doing. Well, anyway, Pavlov was smart enough to realize that he discovered something unexpected. After a few days of ringing the bell and the assistant would come feed all the dogs would go crazy whenever the bell would ring. They knew that the bell meant food. So, following along on the PowerPoint yet again, the unconditioned stimulus, or unlearned, was the dog food. Food automatically causes the dogs to salivate. But there is learning that takes place here. The conditioned stimulus is the bell. And what was the reaction? Saliva, salivation. So how could the unconditioned response and the conditioned response be the same? Well, because the dogs learned to associate the bell with food. The meaning of it, I should say, became the same thing to the dogs. Oh, I hear the bell, I'm going to eat. I see food in front of me, I'm going to eat. Pavlov actually measured the amount of saliva in the dogs' mouths, and they were similar when they heard the bell or just when food was presented to them. So, let's backtrack a little. A stimulus causes a response. If you're sleeping and someone pounds their fist on a table, the stimulus is the pounding of the fist, and the response is you wake up. A stimulus causes a response. We're talking about involuntary behavior. I understand that you could produce saliva if you felt like it, but that's not what we're talking about. Usually it happens naturally and it's involuntary. So the unconditioned part is what you didn't plan on doing, whether you're a person or an animal. And the conditioned part is the stimulus, what you learn from. So, once again, that probably wasn't very clear. The unconditioned stimulus, the food. because it naturally produces saliva. But the conditioned part is the bell. The stimulus that's conditioned is the bell because it causes saliva just the same as the food did. Now, Pavlov furthered this research. Generalization, the dog soon learned to react to anything similar to the bell, whether it was a note on the piano or two spoons clanking together. The dogs would bark and pant, and he would look in their mouths and the little tubes that he put in there. Yes, saliva was being produced when anything similar was presented as a sound. Discrimination. Pavlov taught the dogs to discriminate between different sounds. Not discrimination as we often use it socially, but telling the difference between different stimuli. Discrimination. So after a while, the dogs learned that one sound meant food, whereas another sound meant they were not getting food. Extinction. Pavlov made the behavior go away or become extinct by feeding them later on and not ringing the bell and not feeding them. This was weeks later, but the dogs learned the bell no longer means food. The two were paired initially, and now they are unpaired, for lack of a better word. Spontaneous recovery. A weird thing happened several weeks after the experiment was over. Somebody rang the bell, whether it was Pavlov or his assistant who worked in the lab, and the dogs went crazy. Somehow in the back of their minds, they knew the bell still meant food. The behavior came back. The response came back. So that is spontaneous recovery. Now, John Watson. He was an American psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, and he did a study in 1919 to prove that fears can be conditioned. You can even learn to be afraid. Classical conditioning, because it isn't something you plan on doing. His study was honestly a little mean, a little cruel. What Watson did with his favorite student, Rosalie Rayner, they ended up getting married, but that's another story. Anyway, Watson and Rayner went to the hospital at Johns Hopkins University where he worked, and they found a little baby. They called him Albert, wasn't his real name apparently, and they brought him to the basement of the hospital. Now, Watson had just read an article by Sigmund Freud talking about unconsciously why a little boy was afraid of the family horse. Excuse my language, but Watson went into his Psych 101 class and described that article as bullshit. He said, that's not how it works. The little boy learned to be afraid of the horse. Something happened and he became afraid of the horse. He learned it. So Watson and Rayner brought this little baby, different baby, to the basement of Johns Hopkins University Hospital. Not the kid that Freud was talking about, of course. That happened in Europe. This one happened in Baltimore, Maryland. And they made this poor little baby afraid of a white rat that it initially liked. They brought the rat out and the baby liked it. It wasn't afraid of it. But when they made loud noises in the baby's ears, he became afraid of the rat. Every time he'd see the rat, loud noises, the baby learned to be afraid. So, you think that's bad enough? In follow-up days, Watson and Rayner did the same thing with bunny rabbits, Santa Claus masks, white fur coats, anything white and furry, the baby became afraid of it. Generalization of the fear. But let's backtrack again a little bit. The unconditioned stimulus, the baby did not need to learn to be afraid of loud noises, and the reaction was crying. The baby learned to be afraid of white rats and then generalized it to anything white and furry because the fear became generalized and the response, crying. Kind of like in Pavlov's study, the response was salivating, saliva, no matter whether it was the bell ringing or the food placed in front of the dog. Well, same thing here. It didn't matter whether the baby saw the rat or had loud noises in his ears. He was afraid either way. The stimulus causes the response. So there's a cute little slide in this PowerPoint showing the dog and the bell and the dog food and the saliva. Even a little picture on the next slide of John Watson and little Albert. Crazy story, huh? But that is exactly what happened. That kind of research could not be done today. There are ethical standards, especially involving children. No way that you could get away with that. Well, that's classical conditioning, learning an involuntary behavior. Something gets in your eye, you blink, and you cover your eye. It's not planned, you just do it. But could you learn that you fear a certain situation, or that machine at the eye doctor where they blow a puff of air into your eyeball? Yeah, you could learn to blink all the time when you're around that. Learned behavior, classical conditioning. But a different kind of learning is operant conditioning. This is voluntary behavior. You are learning to voluntarily do something on purpose because you want the reward. Two people to know in this part of the chapter, Edward Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. Thorndike is the first researcher of it. He called this not operant conditioning, but he called it instrumental conditioning. His theory was known as the law of effect. We just talked about dogs, right? Let's talk about cats. Thorndike worked with cats. He put them in this box, kind of cage-like thing, and the cats had to learn that if they pushed on a certain part of the cage, they got out. And if they didn't, well, they were trapped in there. Now, if any of you have cats at home, you know that they like to crawl in small places, but they don't like for you to force them into those places, do they? Thorndike knew this. He wore gloves and everything, put them in this wooden cage, closed the door. The cats would hiss at him and claw. But when the cats realized, oh, wait a minute, if I push on this side, the door opens and I get my food and I get my freedom, it worked. So Thorndike said, if you do a behavior and it's followed by a satisfying state of affairs, you are more likely to do that behavior again, to repeat the behavior. The law of effect was his theory, and he called it instrumental conditioning, but B.F. Skinner, more famous than Thorndike, I would argue, renamed it operant conditioning. So, that's what we're going to talk about now. By the way, dogs, cats, yeah, they can learn, but Skinner used pigeons. He thought they were the stupidest animal, and if he could teach pigeons all kinds of complicated tricks, well, imagine what a human could learn if a pigeon could learn that much by what he called reinforcement, rewarding their behavior. So according to B.F. Skinner, it all starts with shaping. You need to gradually get the person or the animal to do the desired behavior. So if you go get a new kitten and he doesn't understand the litter box, you might need to reward the kitten for just going into that room, for smelling the litter box, for putting one paw in it and moving around the sand. And then eventually, once he gets it right, you reward him even more. Rewards for each little step and then for the completion. Same thing with human children. When you're teaching them how to clean their rooms, it might need to be one step at a time, or potty training, same thing. Skinner is the one who mainstreamed this. If you grew up with points and color systems and everything else, stickers at home, at school, elsewhere, after-school programs, B.F. Skinner pretty much invented this form of rewarding or reinforcing. Now, speaking of reinforcements, primary versus secondary. A primary reinforcement is something that biologically rewards. So, if you're hungry, that would be food. If you're thirsty, something to drink. Look, I have my water bottle here. If you need to go to the bathroom, if you need sleep, biologically reinforcing. That's primary. But secondary is things that you want. You want attention, you want good grades, you want jewelry, and even money. Now, is there anything that could be both? I would argue maybe only candy or sweets. If you are like diabetic or have low blood sugar, you might want it and need it at the same time. Usually those things are different though. Reinforcement, biological, primary. Secondary, things that you want. It might feel like you need them, but you really want them. So, shaping, there's an example of teaching a dog how to fetch a ball. You might need to reward in small little steps. Moving right along, primary and secondary, there's examples too in the PowerPoint. Operant conditioning. Here's where Skinner gets just a little bit complicated. Skinner did a ton of research on this, over 40 years of research, and he learned a lot from human and animal behavior. First of all, schedules of reinforcement. According to Skinner, the worst type is continuous. Every time the person or the animal does the behavior, there's a reward. That's a continuous schedule, and it's not a good one, according to Skinner. How come? Because you learn to expect the reward. When there's no reward, you won't do the behavior. You could get tired of the reward. I have too much candy already, or too many cookies, or too many points. It loses its reinforcing value if it's continuous. So Skinner pointed out that it's better if it's unpredictable, the reward. So therefore, we get into other schedules. Variable ratio, fixed ratio. Variable interval, fixed interval. Let me explain. Variable means you don't know when the reward is coming. Fixed means it's predictable. You know when you're getting the reinforcement, but it's not every time. A ratio is the number of behaviors that you need to do, whereas an interval is time that goes by. So let's put all of those into terms. Fixed ratio. You have to do the behavior a certain number of times, and then you get rewarded. Every third sale at work. Every fifth time you turn in homework, you get extra credit. It's a fixed schedule, but it's based on your behavior. What about variable ratio? Well, you have to do the behavior, but you don't know when the reward is coming. It's a certain number of behaviors. Maybe at work, after your 12th sale, you get a bonus. And then after the 19th sale, you get an hour off, but you still get paid for it. Maybe there's rewards, but you don't know when they're coming. But it is based on your behavior. Now, what about interval? Time has to go by. Time on a clock, time on a stopwatch, time on a calendar. Fixed interval. Do you have a job where you get paid every other Friday? Well, isn't that a fixed interval? It's a fixed amount of time that goes by. Variable interval. What if children have to stay seated in their third grade classroom and they get, I don't know, a piece of candy or something after 10 minutes, and then 7 more minutes, and then 12 more minutes? That's variable. Time that goes by, but you don't know when that time will be. Now, there's an example of gambling, like on a slot machine in Vegas or in one of our local casinos. That is variable ratio, because you don't know when the reward is coming. That's why it's so addicting. You might get rewarded 2 or 3 times in a row. You might lose 9 or 10 times in a row, but it's based on number of behaviors, not time that goes by. It's variable. Why am I bringing this up? Variable is more addicting. It's the same thing with bad romantic relationships, where the other person is only nice to you once in a while, and usually you're not treated well. Variable. It's more addicting when you don't know when the reward is coming. It's hard to get out of it. It's hard to know when to quit, just like gambling. So, that's an important factor. You want to keep the behavior going? Reinforce variably rather than in a fixed pattern, or continuous would be the worst. Keep it unpredictable. That's what Skinner said for people and animals. There's an example in your PowerPoints about fishing. That's variable. I don't know how many of you enjoy that activity, but you have to admit it's unpredictable. And that keeps people going because you don't know when that reward is coming when you catch a fish. Next thing on this PowerPoint slide and in the chapter, learned helplessness. Martin Seligman has been a well-known psychologist for decades, but perhaps his most famous study was learned helplessness. This is a little mean, but not quite as cruel as what John Watson and Rosalie Rayner did. What Seligman did was put dogs in a cage and shocked the bottom of it, not to really hurt them, but enough to annoy them. The dogs would try to get out and get away from that electric shock. Well, after a while, the dogs just laid there and took it and didn't even try. Seligman would open the door, do the shock, the dogs wouldn't even try to get out. It wasn't like they were injured or anything. It was just that they gave up. They learned to be helpless. Seligman argues this explains depression in people. You've had enough bad relationships, enough failed job attempts, whatever the case may be, you learn to give up and you learn to be depressed. Now, punishment. If reinforcement makes a person or an animal do the behavior more often, what about punishment? Punishment makes you do it less often or not at all. So let's talk about spanking as a form of punishment. I don't want to start a debate with you, or anyone for that matter, of whether parents should spank children. But I can tell you something. If that's the only trick you have up your sleeve, the only consequence that you know, it's not going to be very effective long term. How come? According to research, the child will grow older and not care anymore. Try spanking a 3-year-old versus a 15-year-old. Big difference, huh? The older the kid gets, the less they care about that as a consequence. Also, the child will learn not to do the behavior in front of you. Saying bad words, breaking things, whatever, the behavior won't necessarily stop, it just won't happen in your presence. Third thing is, the child will learn to be aggressive. Children who are spanked a lot often act out aggressively toward younger children, toward animals, and toward people and animals that can't fight back, basically. And then the fourth thing is, when you think about it, spankings tell you what you're going to get spanked for, but not what you should do. It doesn't teach appropriate good behaviors. Rudolf Dreikurs was famous mostly in the 60s and 70s, and some of the early 1980s for his research on other things that can be done to stop or curb bad behaviors that are not necessarily spanking and punishments. First one, natural consequences. Sometimes the parent or the caregiver can do nothing. What do you think he meant by that? Well, a child runs around with his shoes untied, let him fall down. A child doesn't listen and, touches the hot stove, he might have to get burned. Now, you don't want your child to really get injured, of course, but there are some natural consequences that make a lot of sense. You took your stuffed animal into the mall and you lost it as a little kid? Well, you don't have it anymore. That's a natural consequence. That's a little different than the next step, according to Dreikurs. If there is no natural consequence, or it's dangerous, or the kid isn't learning, logical consequence. You break a window, you have to clean it up and pay for it. You pee on the toilet seat, you have to clean it up. Something logical. So natural is you do nothing, you let nature take its course, but logical is the next step. You make the consequence fit the bad behavior. And if none of those things work, then Dreikurs says you go on to a punishment. Grounding, spanking, timeout, whatever. Moving right along. I really like this chart on the next page of the PowerPoint because years ago I used to have to draw this on the board and my artwork, let's just say, is not so good. Latent learning. Ed Tolman at the University of California, Berkeley, he did this study with laboratory rats. In fact, he kind of made that famous rat mazes. What Tolman did was had rats in 3 different groups. The first group of rats, they got rewarded, probably a piece of cheese, for doing the rat successfully. The rat lab, I should say, the maze, successfully. It didn't happen right away. It took several days for them to learn it. But the quicker they learned it, the quicker they got their piece of cheese or whatever reward he had waiting for them. So basically, if you look at the PowerPoint, the number of mistakes went down pretty substantially and pretty quickly. But what if there was no reward? That's group 2 of the rats that were waiting to do the maze. No reward at all? The number of mistakes barely changed. It kinda flatlined. It barely improved at all. But wait a minute, here's what you want to know for the test. How about group 3? There was no reward for 10 days, and then a reward on day 11. Guess what happened? Very little change in the rat's behavior, and then drastically, the number of mistakes went down. So what did Tolman say? The rats knew how to do the maze, but they weren't going to show their learning until later. Latent learning, later, kind of sounds the same, doesn't it? They had the knowledge in their head, the rats did, but they didn't display it until they were rewarded halfway through the experiment. So I think that's interesting. Rats can think about something and not display their behavior until later. And when is that later? When they get rewarded. Now, that is called latent learning. It's not classical conditioning and it's not operant. It's a third kind of learning. But now there is a 4th kind as well, and this will be the last one that we are going to talk about. Social or observational learning. Same thing. Learning that occurs just by watching others. This happens a lot. You watch somebody swing a baseball bat or shoot a free throw. If you're an athlete, you can learn that way. You watch another child read, you might learn how to read. Playing the piano or another instrument, same thing. Learning by watching. Now, what Albert Bandura did at Stanford University to prove that this can happen is had 4 groups of children separated, they didn't see each other, watching an adult, like me or you, beat up on a Bobo doll. If you've never had one of these toys, they're a lot of fun. You blow it up with air, it has like a clown face on it or something, it's weighted down at the bottom, there's something heavy in the bottom, and you punch it, and what happens? It goes down to the ground and it pops back up to you. Great for relieving frustration, huh? Well, when kids saw a grown-up beat up on the Bobo doll, and then later they're allowed to play in a classroom full of toys and left by themselves, most of the kids beat up on the Bobo doll. So after that was proven, group 2, Albert Bandura thought, what if they watched it on video? In the morning, they watch a video of a grown-up beating up on a Bobo doll. Later in the day, they get to play in a room by themselves. Guess what? They beat up on the Bobo doll. Group 3, what if it was a cartoon they watched in the morning of a cartoon cat beating up on a Bobo doll? Later in the day, they get to play in a room by themselves with a bunch of toys. Guess what? They picked out the Bobo doll and beat up on it. But what if group 4 didn't see any violence? That's exactly what happened. They watched a nature video. Later in the day, when they were allowed to play with toys in a room, they did not typically act aggressively or violently toward any of the toys. And not surprisingly, they didn't pick the Bobo doll more often than any other type of toy. So basically, children repeated the violence that they saw. Now, here's a couple of things for the exam to know. 1, some people are biased or prejudiced in their minds without realizing it, even if they don't think they are, and they're like, you know what? I bet the boys did that. Girls would never act that way. Or, you know what? I bet it was the older kids, the cute little ones. they wouldn't do that. Or maybe it was one of those minority kids, because white people or us Asian people or whatever you are, we don't act that way. Wrong, wrong, and wrong. It was all the children who acted out that way if they saw the aggression or the violence in the first place. However, strange finding, Group 2 was the most aggressive toward the Bobo doll. And if you remember, they are the ones who saw it happen on video. So what does that say about children watching violent videos, TV shows, movies, maybe even violent video games? They are more likely to act it out. But obviously that doesn't explain everything. There are plenty of kids who engage in those kinds of activities and they don't become violent or aggressive, yet there are other kids who do. So obviously this explains some things, but not everything about human nature. Social learning, also known as observational learning. So the 4 kinds of learning we went over in this chapter: classical conditioning, involuntary behavior, such as being afraid, producing saliva to digest food, blinking when something gets in your eye. Yeah, you could do those things voluntarily, but usually they're involuntary. Operant conditioning. You operate on your environment. That's where the name comes from. So you do something because you want a reward or a reinforcement. Next one was latent learning. Tolman studies of rats in a maze or a lab. And what did they do? Well, they knew the information, but they weren't going to display it until later. Latent, later, until they got a reward. And then the 4th kind of learning is social or observational learning. Learning by simply watching others and then following what they did. So you want to know those 4 kinds of learning. You also want to know learned helplessness, punishment, and natural and logical consequences. I realize this was kind of a long chapter with a lot of information, but if you understand everything that we've gone over here, you will be in good shape to do the assignments and the quizzes and the exam that will be coming up. And that's about it for this one. Thanks for watching.